I want to talk this afternoon mainly about how churches might address the possibility of attracting a significant amount of people under 40 in their worship. This is not my brainstorming. As I said last night, I guess there is a time for that, but I don't think it's worth your time unless I have evidence of it working. So I'm going to basically talk about how other churches in the United States have done this successfully. And primarily what I'm going to be doing is running down a list, this list that I would have you hold. Both of these will need to use eventually. But here what I want to do is just look at a long list of ways that churches have successfully, in the middle of severe or moderate decline, in a primarily older congregation, succeeded in attracting a significant number of young people to turn things around. And this list is a little over 25 things that I'll suggest because it's worked. I want to say that this is not an exclusive list. I don't want to say unless you do all of these things, it won't work. On the other hand, I want to say that unless there's no use in trying one or two of these things, one has to do 8 or 10 before anything will work. I also want to say that as I've worked around the country, and especially in my part of the United States, at the request of my bishop, I've been working with churches in decline as a consultant. And there, one of the main things when we are looking at this massive decline in Christian church attendance, we have to look very plainly at whether there is an audience outside of the congregation. So we do very strong demographic studies as to who is within 3 to 10 miles, depending on the denseness of the population, as to who's there. My understanding is that you all in Australia also have these kind of demographic studies. So I can, in any place I go, I can call up the demographics themselves, not only in general, but relative to people's interest in spirituality and religion, their age, and pages of what their opinions are on various issues. My understanding is that you all also have that access, and so it's my bishop and I have agreed that if there is a population that is primarily aging, that there's no possibility. If there is a population where there are very successful churches, there's no possibility for a declining church. In other words, if the competition is too big, it's best not to try. If there's only a predominantly aging population, there's no reason to try. In other words, my bishop and I have agreed that, in fact, my job as a consultant is not to sell them on a pipe dream, but rather to maybe close the institution so that that money could be used someplace where there is more than a pipe dream. So just that as a background. Needless to say, I do need to say it, at least for my own comfort, I don't know your culture. Some of the wonderful things that happened in this workshop earlier was that people told me where I needed to know more, and we were helped by it. So I'm going to just walk through this list 10 at a time and stop in between to ask your responses and thoughts. So these are just really specific, strategic things to do, of which one I propose needs to do at least 8 to 10 of them. Okay, the first thing, movable seating in the round, adjusted so that at least 2 places for leadership to be seen by all. I want to say that just doing that is a huge step. So in which people see each other rather than the backs of their heads. The demographic of young people has a lot to do with people who are lonely, who need community, and who have a lot to give to the larger population. And so it simply is an unwelcoming presence to come in, especially perhaps with the age range stacked against you, in which you are not comfortable. Second, projection facilities. It's really important to be able to show beauty in the sanctuary by projection, to have snippets of things that happen in society, to have a pointed way of illustrating some key issues or complexities. I don't mean always be showing slides the entire worship service. I mean the possibility of doing that sometimes, fairly regularly. Third, rich and striking visuals. It's amazing how, for most of the history of church, the main thing you did was make your space beautiful. I mean, think of the cathedrals. Think of so many centuries in which the main thing you provided was a beautiful, striking visual. By and large today, the places where people worship are plain, sloppy, or of an aesthetic that is not of our time. I want to say, have something rich, striking, and beautiful. Remember, not all of this is doable, but some of it is. As much natural objects as possible. Water in pools or running, not just, but including baptismals. Rocks and soil, significant plant life, animals where possible. I'm not talking about the zoo. I'm not talking just about once a year for the blessing of animals. But what I am saying is, I know dozens of congregations personally where the fact that a person can bring their pet makes a difference between them coming or not. The fact that someone else brought their pet is so exciting to some people. Not everybody. Not that there's an occasion, not some barking that needs to be dealt with, but it is very important to think about this, especially then without the animals or with not just animals, to have beautiful plant life, to have designs of stones in prominent places. Multiple, at least 4 microphones for easy access for the congregation. This is simply a way of being welcome, of signaling, and then in worship doing, the fact that a number of people can speak without practically killing themselves or embarrassing themselves getting to it. It's quite clear that one of the deaths of Protestantism has been simply the fact that the clergy do all of the talking. People come to worship for their lives to matter to God and to one another and the community. So the worship itself has to involve people speaking. Few but some explicit Christian symbols. So to have as a part of the larger beauty symbols relating to Christianity is good. To have them as a part of other symbols that represent more than Christianity is better. To have no Christian symbols is bad. It's confusing. It's quite clear that the under 40 crowd will be offended if it's dominatingly Christian. Not at all offended if there's some Christianness there. After all, they just walked into a church. Open space for movement, dance, small group gatherings as a part of the larger gatherings. So here it's important for a kind of movement go on during the worship service. So I know a congregation where at least 700 people come every time. And every worship service, the pastor says, okay, break up into groups of 4 or 5 and talk about this for 5 minutes. Break up into 4 or 5 and pray for each other for 5 minutes. And then 700 people do that because they're not in pews. I mean, you can't do that. You can't have that kind of intimate contact in a larger group unless the adjustable space is available. In addition, very often now you will see different places of prayer where people can, in the middle of the service, go over and sit next to the bubbling stream because they have just had something really terrible happen, or because they're tired of listening to the pastor. And so just get up and go over there. And know that this is your space. This is your space for your kind of comfort, nurture, and inspiration. Small meditation spaces similarly available for private prayer and meditation within the larger space. Okay, let me stop there and hear you with any thoughts, protests, or questions. We'll go on to the rest. There's...
Hal, I'd just like to say that I think we do all appreciate that those things help. I think we really do. But what I'd like to say is that we have a profoundly different situation in Australia in that it simply is not cool to go to a church. It's just not acceptable. For instance, in Canberra, the seat of government in Australia, some very right-wing people in the government make a feature of being Christian, which doesn't endear Christianity to most of the intelligentsia in the place. And it's just, it's so uncool that it's embarrassing to admit that you are a Christian or that you go to church. And I think that that's in Australia what we need some help with, because, for instance, the church that does attract thousands of people is called Hillsong. It's a very fundamentalist place. There's a big emphasis on the amount of money you contribute to the church, and there have been very public showings of the corruption of some of the leaders of that church. So it's not got a good look. So, you know, even where the church has been successful in that kind of way, with lots of dancing and singing and noise, it has not got a good reputation in Australia, and I deeply regret that, but I think we have to face it.
Thank you so much. So that was one of the stumbling questions that I came to you all with from my country. I've pastored in Europe. I've lived in Europe for a long time, and so the way I phrased that question, when I heard that there's like 11% of the population going to church, the way I phrase that question, and still have it, is it over with for Australia? In other words, is it too late? Because in Europe it is. Right now, churches are basically museums with weird little blips of brief evangelical fervor around the edges. So I frankly am ready to simply accept what you say. I think the workshop has to do with people who think it's not yet finished. But I would want to say to you, yeah, I can get that, because I've been in an entire continent where it's the case. It does seem to me that your situation, where you have very right-wing religious leadership in your city, and a lot of young secular people, that there's a possibility that they're actually wanting to have community, wanting to have real spiritual experience, and that there's nobody else in the market besides Eastern religion, which is doing quite well, thank you. So I would want to say, to be cool would be do 8 of what we just said. We had young people in the workshop in the earlier session who said, exactly. I don't want to trust myself that much. Other thoughts? Here comes a microphone.
I'm interested in, and I love being in the round rather than lecture style. I'm also thinking about how it is that in Taizé community, which you referred to last night, there's this extraordinary visual of everybody looking to the front. Mm-hmm. maybe it's not quite right, you can sit on the side, but essentially your eyes are to go to the front, to the focus of the icons, the candles, and the sense of that's where the sacred focus should be.
Right.
And that's what young people accept there fully. Maybe that's because they haven't thought about too many other alternatives. So when we're sitting in the round, we're looking at each other, and there is the potential to be rather distracted because we're taking in who's here and, all sorts of things. Is it also a little bit about pandering to the me people? Well, we're all a bit me, but the sense of it's all about me. Do you want to comment on those two things?
Sure,
Of the
sure.
two focus.
Yeah, I love Taizé. I lived there. I've started Taizé groups in other places. So yeah, that's important. By the way, I was in Taizé last spring, and it's now so big that it's not all looking forward, just because they've had to break out new walls. So there are about a third of them looking sideways now. But I don't think that matters. Your point is better than that. Yeah, I'm not talking about how to have a 1,500 person worship service. That's a cathedral-style worship that I think works around the world in some places. I'm just talking about building congregations. In other words, here I want to make a distinction between congregation and cathedral, in that I think the congregations as a larger entity say that they're interested in forming community. And so what I'm saying is it's very helpful, not mandatory, but very helpful to have the shape of community. And the third question was distraction. Well, if you're going to build a community, you have to breathe in the distractions that are going on across the way. You have to notice that someone's crying. You have to notice that someone's disturbed or happy or has a dog. And that's just part of the sloppy genius of congregation, is you really actually know each other.
Can I just ask one other question,
Yes.
building on what Gillian, and I guess both the Gillians have said? This list to me looks like what does happen in a lot of, not all of it, but most of it, in some of the prosperity theology type religious settings in Australia. And I like the idea of it, but I'm just wondering if there's anything unique that we would apply in a progressive theology setting, or are we just going to borrow everything that happens in the evangelical and Pentecostal areas of theology in terms of practice?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I don't think there's any chance of the right theology winning the day, especially the 40 and under. It's not about, as they said in St. Lydia's last night, it's not about getting your belief system right. It's about being a part of a deep communion of people together. That's what that demographic says. They don't say, please tell me what to believe. Matter of fact, they come usually in spite of one's left wing or right wing stuff. Yeah, got there. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was just saying it's
Yeah,
about
sorry.
individualism. It's about me and my experience, and it's not such. It looks like community, and people experience it in that way. But when push comes to shove, they disappear into the ether in the long term because the depth is not there. It's very empty. It's because it focuses constantly on me and what I'm going to gain rather than what I can contribute to assist the community to grow. And, you know, like that's what I find with some of this. It looks like church cha-cha-cha. You know, it's like, yeah, I'm going to go away feeling good, but does it have any depth to it? Which I think is what Gillian was saying. You know, people experience Taizé as a kind of depth experience, but people there are all facing forward. So why does the form, how does the form of worship reflect the depth of spirituality? That's my question, I guess.
Yeah, that's really so important. You know, I think it is it's predominantly about the shape of what you're doing. It's not about your thinking. It is about the authenticity of your relationships. And I really do think that this question about focusing always on oneself or focusing all on what one can do for the world, both are caricatures. And so, as I understand the genius of congregational worship, is that it's a real deep mix of meeting people's need for nurture, loss, joy, and belonging to a larger whole. So I think that, and you're right, prosperity gospels are primarily focused on oneself. Just because a real communitarian shape to them is helpful to them doesn't mean that that's where everyone needs to go. Indeed, it seems to me like most folks really know about the authenticity of both claiming one's own needs and being present to one another and to being a part of the larger world. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Can I maybe compliment and challenge some of the things that have been said? The origin of Christianity in this country came as a prison. So it was convicts. The chaplain came from the Methodist end of the Church of England. The first church was burnt down within 3 weeks. And it isn't quite true that the convicts went to church with whips and chains, but it got fairly close. So there's always been this tension between that origin and the other sort of things that came with the settlers. The second thing is, it seems to me that theology is on a continuum with, say, Hillsong at one end and progressive at the other, and people pick which ones that are which ones suit them. And thirdly, I have members of my family who belong to the equivalent of Hillsong in Brisbane, and they are engaged in their community. They're not, and it certainly hasn't made them wealthy, but the attraction to it has to do with, even there was a strong community and the style of worship, and especially the music and the tech stuff. And I guess the fourth thing I'd say is that when you get something like, say, the Da Vinci Code or some religious program on general television as against religious television, it's surprising the number of people young people who discuss that at great depth, so that there's a sort of underlying thing which we haven't worked out how to tap.
Thanks so much. That all is deeply helpful to me. I'm going to read a few more.
Could I just put in one word?
Oh,
Sorry to hold
please.
you up because we never get to the end of the list.
That's what we're here for.
I've got adult children, 26 and 30, and they came here as little children to the Sunday school, but then we fade away, and then my husband and I have just come back. But I would love something, some reason for them to come here, but they wouldn't come here. It does not speak to them. And we haven't really inculcated any philosophy in them that would lead them. But they've got loads of problems, and they both work in helping professions where they tell me horrific stories of loads of people in their generation with problems, personal problems, and problems that obviously cry out for community and exactly what we get by being elderly sort of members here. But, you know, like, I would love them to have a reason to find exactly what the formula is here, the community. But I don't know. I don't know. I think the seating would be good, but I don't know all those other things would be conducive. I think the message, like what's advertised outside this building, what's happening in here, if there were things that were happening here that people under 40 might think, "Oh, that's really what I need to know about." I do think you would have to appeal to people on a heart level or an intellectual level. And maybe it should be things that happen on Sunday afternoon, and eventually they'd think, "I'll try out coming on the Sunday morning." But to use the building and the place as a place where community can form for those people, I think you need to appeal to their needs. What are their needs? And there's a huge need in that generation.
Thank you. So there would not be any reason for me not to take what you've said at face value. In other words, it's too late. So my experience is limited to my culture, in which the churches are in deep decline, especially what we call the mainline cultures. And what I'm speaking to you of is how hundreds of them have turned that around. And I would say the main message there is that the younger people need community, a sense of belonging, and a sense of spiritual aliveness on their own terms. I wouldn't want to argue that this is not too late. I would want to say that my presuppositions from my experiences are that actually young people under 40 are really pretty desperate for community. And I think that there's probably only one institution in your society that can provide it. By and large, no more than 200 seating capacity. If you're thinking about congregational form, what you need is a sense of real belonging to one another in worship. And we'll talk about some of this a little bit later, but once you get beyond 200, you're into something other than a congregational worship. If you happen to get over 200 belonging, have another service. That's exactly where very successful things go in my country, is that you have the same warm, welcoming, alive event, not once, but twice or 3 times. Worship leadership seated among the people. Every reason to not identify the high holiness of the leaders, but to really say we all belong together. In our case, robe, vestment, dresses, ties, we have no wisdom. We see successes with people wearing robes, with people not wearing robes, with people wearing ties or dresses, or none of the above. Downgrade the place of the sermon in the larger worship. No more than 15 minutes devoted to the sermon. And then this list I'm going to go into in a little bit more detail in a minute in the next items. Most of the activity in the worship devoted to singing, other kinds of music than singing, collective meditation and prayer, silence, readings, drama, dance, and children. Sermons are short, well-crafted, emotionally present, and socially aware. So what we see is that if the sermon is boring, it does not fulfill the needs of the community. The community needs to have that, but the sermon is not the center. Singing, now we're going into that list in a little bit more depth. Singing that is primarily world music, chanting, responses to meditation and prayer, new compositions. Hymns comprise no more than one per worship. So this seems, frankly, across the board in my experience. And we're talking at least those thousands, the 1,000 congregations we talked about last night. Hymns have had a wonderful history in Protestantism. Hymns have been sort of limited in the larger history. Before Protestantism, hymns didn't get sung in church. And hymns are now not appealing to the under 40 by and large. Now, once in a while, you find a pop singer singing a hymn and making lots of money, right? I'm not saying that no hymns, and they'll never work, because they've seeped into the larger culture. There's some wonderful ways that they work. But if you want to make the under 40 folks comfortable, sing their music. This is not what we call praise bands in America, which is what the evangelicals had so much success in between 1985 and 2005, in which you got a good rock band in there. Right now, praise bands in America are on the decline rapidly because the young people think they're funny. And the young people want hybrid music. They want all kinds of different music. They don't want what the generation before them wanted, and that's a lot of rock music. Other kinds of music, other than singing, focuses on meditation, prayer, praise, lament. Such music features both professional and congregational participation, a variety of music, of world music, jazz music, classical music instruments, as well as a healthy dose of a cappella music, both performed professionally and with congregation. In other words, this is when you talk to the under 40 crowd, they really like a mix of music. They like classical music, but not too much. They like world music especially. They like chanting. They don't mind a hymn now and then. So the palette is bigger now in the general cultures. And so that is where a congregation can signal welcoming and accepting of who one is. Now, what the words say matter is one thing, so you don't want to just throw up anything there, but you also want to know that a lot of times you don't have to have words at all, and you don't have to have a word police. You have to have a generous opening, which gives what music always gives, feeling inside and between people. That makes sense. Collective meditation and prayer is the predominant dimension of worship. A significant portion of the worship, no less than 10 minutes, no more than 15, involves congregation members speaking what is on its hearts and minds. These speakings are often punctuated by sung or instrumental music. In addition to this regular practice in every worship service, specific worship services ask for times of silence, speaking, and singing about particular kinds of moments: sadness, joy, grief, longing, confusion, seasons of the natural and liturgical year, national or regional happenings, tragedies, and festive occasions. So this is, frankly, as far as I know in my country, it's clearly a success all over the place. And that is the chance for the congregation to take between 10 and 15 minutes for anyone to speak their prayer, their meditation, an event in their life, to give a time in which somebody says, I lost my job this week. Or, I was walking down the street yesterday and there was this weird person next to me and I was kind of fearful. Or, I just saw the most amazing set of flowers in my backyard. Or, I can't get rid of the thought of all of those poor people in this neighborhood. 10 or 15 minutes in which it's not a pastoral prayer about what the pastor thinks people may be thinking. It's not any kind of specific form that you have to speak. It's just your chance for under a minute, maybe sometimes two, to speak what's happened to you in your life, to speak what you long for in the bigger world. I mean, this is in the tens of thousands of churches who do that. And there's tons of troubleshooting. Because what happens when the person who started to talk about their divorce is all of a sudden falling on the floor crying? What do you do then? Well, what you do then is you have three people who know how to do that, in which all of a sudden someone's beside him or her on the floor, staying with them, praying with them, holding them, taking them out, bringing them back for a blessing or a prayer. What if somebody prays or talks too long every Sunday? Then you take them aside and say, thanks for all of that, but we need to have somebody else have some space too. If they get mad and leave, they get mad and leave. Okay, I'm going to stop. I got 5 or 10 more, and we've only got 11 minutes, but the important thing is our interaction. So let's have some other responses. Again, as you remember, I'm not saying do all of this. I'm saying, but if you don't do 8 or 10, don't bother.
You spoke last night about restarting the churches and how some of the congregation would hate you for it.
Yeah,
I just wanted to know what sort of things you did to actually restart at the beginning.
Yeah, and I will tell you that, but I want to say that what I did is not always the thing you do in every other congregation to restart. I want to say also that some of the best ways of doing all of this work is out of the guts of a failed congregation. You've got a lot of opportunities. So what we did is that first horrific Sunday when I had 7 old people there, I had already studied the demographics of the community around, and there were tons of young people ready to come to church. The year before, they found they had 1 or 2 families a week coming in, seeing, and leaving. I had a jazz pianist on the first Sunday. On the second Sunday, I said, do you want to have us just celebrate who you are and close? Or do you want to go on? And then I said, here's what I'm going to do if you want to do it. I will have my sermon. We will have the hymns for the one young family that's coming each week, or 2 or 3. And we won't think about you. I apologize in advance, but this is our only hope. On the third Sunday, I preached a sermon in which I talked about Benjamin Franklin, and he sat in a chair with a sun and the horizon and said, I don't know whether that sun is rising or setting. And I asked that of us. I didn't give an answer. So in other words, I kept it clear that we were on the edge. And I started doing things directly. I changed all of the music. Hardly sang a hymn. Yeah, so that's some of it.
Hal, some of us loved the website that you showed of the church that just joined together to have a meal. And it's a bit sad that it's not really listed on your things to do, but that appeals to me the most. And I've seen the way meals can draw people together, and preparing and putting away as well. And I just wondered, could you tell us a little bit about, how they got that going? And because that would be, I think, a very powerful thing wherever a church is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A number of the founders of that, of St. Lydia's, were seminary students of mine. So I do know the trajectory pretty well. It's a Lutheran church. It's in a very dense pocket of New York City where a lot of young people live. The building itself is not a church, but a former factory with some of the things built up around it. They got an original small amount of money from the Lutherans to kickstart it, but I think it was under $10,000. And I never believed they were going to make it. And they did. The reason I didn't believe it is it's so much work to put it to cook a meal. Yeah, from raw materials and everything. They were just, they put me to shame in my thinking they are going to still be 7.5 people wishing that people would come. But they lived in the right neighborhood. And they talked about it. They did a lot of, in this kind of setting, the website is everything. In our country, 70% of the people who come to church new come from websites. So the young people knew how to do that. But again, and there are now, I probably know 25 congregations like that are doing that. I still think it's a hard way to go, but they still keep having success.
Judge that it would be successful because so many shows on television are about cooking. It's obviously a passion for people, and it's a way of coming together without too much embarrassment of the individual, and I think it's very admirable.
I do too, and this just, for me, the underlying message there is that if you give people under 40 the power and let them go, you have a lot better chance than the older people deciding which good ideas from them would be best for them.
Did the Lutheran was about being kind to each other? You know, how did they...
Oh, it wasn't. It was just the young people's ideas themselves. It was they said, "We're going to do this. Would you give us some money?" So it wasn't really. The Lutherans didn't have much of an idea. They just helped them get started. But I mean, they did, as you heard last night. They thought about Jesus at meals. Is the way they got started, and you may be right. Maybe the cooking shows helped.
Sue, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think that whole thing about letting under 40s set the agenda and the direction and the style that they want is terrific. And so a lot of this seems to me like it's the over 40s actually deciding for them as to what we think would be good for them. But as you've gone through it, I think we do many of these things here, maybe not as fully as you've described, but in some measure already. And that I feel that. I hope other people agree with me a little bit on that. But obviously there'd be great room to expand on it if we chose to, and I'm sure we'll be following up and talking about this. I mean, the whole thing about perhaps changing the style of music is no doubt important, because I've had my son say to me, if I ever were going to go to church, Mum, I'd come here, but you still do hymns, don't you? The thought of changing it to world music or something else in preparation for under 40s coming sounds to me like there'd be a whole lot of music and not much singing happening, because we wouldn't know the words, you know. How do you present that music as something appealing if no one's singing? It'd sound a bit dead and dormouse to me. I think, you know, it would be an attempt to try and do something that we're not able to do because it's not familiar music to us. So I guess, I don't know how you do that transition until you get some people in who recognise it and think, yeah, that's the music I want to hear. We're all going to look at each other and think, huh? So that's one aspect of the singing thing, which would be great to change, but the transition I see is a little bit tricky. And the other one that I'm thinking of as we go through is that when we do offer space and time for people to pray, and it is a matter of often the same people each week praying a similar prayer each week, which we recognise and understand where they're coming from. But if an under 40-year-old were coming in and listening to it, they might wonder about it. I just wonder how the appeal on paper might be different from how it works in practice.
Yeah, thanks.
You'll be here tomorrow. I suppose you'll see how we do things, and I'd be interested to know whether you think we are somewhere along the way to some of these ideas.
Yeah, and we had, in the other workshop, we had a bunch of conversation around this too. I mean, the first thing to say is actually, it's not the question of what's on this paper going into reality. It's that things on the paper already are reality, at least in another culture. So no, you don't try anything unless you've got a big time plan. So for instance, in terms of music, you have to have a staffing and a choir that is completely focused on the new thing. And you don't try it unless you've already got it in hand. And yes, there is years of, so I mean, this is not particularly germane, but it took 2.5 years for my startup to produce 70 people that came in new. And that was a painful 2.5 years, but it was always spiced with 1 or 2 more coming every week or 3. But how you would prepare would be to have volunteers who learned the music, who learned the chants, who learned the world music, so that the next time a person under 40 comes in, they think, I got that. And I don't know those songs either, They would say, but they know it, and I'm going to come back. So you gotta, there's enormous, in other words, this is one of the mainline church predicaments, is what we call the denominationalists in our culture. They think they can keep on doing everything else. You got to stop doing a bunch of things that you do in order to make your worship attractive. So it's hard work and needs really deep skills. In other words, I always say to congregations that I consult with, I say between $100,000 and $200,000 a year is what it'll cost you to be ready for that. Otherwise, you can go on and you'll be in worse shape in 5 years. Okay, we should stop, I think. Okay, we got one more person.
I've got the mic.
Yes,
I suppose I was just going to say we've come from a church that did a lot of this stuff already, and I think it does make a massive difference. I think you've sort of hinted at it, but you've got to get that first person in and they've got to stay so that when the next person comes in, there's already someone that's under 40 or already a young family or whatever to stay with. Because what we have is people coming once, never coming back, a new person coming once, never coming back. So I agree with everything you say, and I don't think the music has to be that complicated. I think it just has to be a bit livelier.
I'd love a jazz band.
And the other thing I'd say is where we were, us older people did all the cooking and the young people did all the eating, so that's a big mistake.
yeah. And you know, if you're talking about this congregation, there were 2 people under 40 in the room, in this congregation, that spoke in the morning, in the other workshop, so you got that one. And I'm actually not saying you only need to get the first one. I'm saying act as if the first 5 are already there, and that it's their service.
I'll get it announced to the wider group as well, but for those who are not members here, I will get all of the presentations and the soft copy handouts up on YouTube or on the parish website in the next week or so, so you'll be able to dip back into the various examples that have been used on the week. Did you want to pull or you want to...
I'd just like to ask you the question, are there any congregations where they have 2 services, one for the traditional members and then a later one or earlier one for the under 40s, like a completely different service and it's more run by them and the other one is run for the traditional people?
Yeah, that's one of the models.
I think that would be great.
Right. I think...
I know you want to go on.
Yeah,
Has
go
anyone mentioned that we're in a heritage building with
Yes.
all kinds of limitations?
Yeah, I have heard that, and that we have the same thing. It's a really interesting set of possibilities and problems. Yeah. Thanks so much. Great to be with you.